Hi, this is the lecture on the final pages of part one. So if you haven't read those final pages, you might want to read them before you listen to this. Um, the end of part one represents the end of the story as an exclusively Igbo story, right? Of this particular place where Okonkwo and his family live. It's about to become a much larger framework in the book. But the moment is also kind of a test for us as readers, especially if you're non African readers, because it's a test of have we gained fluency in this particular society, using a very old school anthropological standard. Do we understand the rules of how the society works well enough that we could actually be within it ourselves? So there's this strange thing that happens right at the very end, right on 24. So everybody's at a funeral, and at the end of the way that people kind of acknowledge and commemorate the person who just died, everyone who has attended the funeral, the men start to throw and shoot guns up into the air. So the last part on 124 at the top of the page is guns fired the last salute, and the cannon rent the sky. And then from the center of the delirious fury came a cry of agony and shouts of horror. It was as if a spell had been cast. All was silent. In the center of the crowd, a boy lay in a pool of blood. It was the dead man's 16-year-old son, who with his brothers and half-brothers had been dancing the traditional farewell to their father. Okonkwo's gun had exploded, and a piece of iron had pierced the boy's heart. And the confusion that followed was without parallel in the tradition of Omofia. Violent deaths were frequent, but nothing like this had ever happened. Okay, in order to know if you're understanding the book at this point, you need to both be able to recognize the mind-boggling, deeply felt sadness that would emerge from this moment, and also why it is weirdly a little bit of a comic moment. Okay, so this is kind of what we have to understand just a little bit more. Okay, so when I say this, the fact that Okonkwo is about to be exiled from his tribe for 7 years and have that personal tragedy happen because he shot somebody at a funeral, right? Why that's a little bit funny needs to be explained, because it's certainly not funny to think of someone actually dying, especially a 16-year-old at a funeral. And this actually involves us having to go back to page 38, which is another scene that in and of itself is not that funny, right? But in the context, you start to see the way that humor and tragedy are really working together in this text in an incredibly sophisticated sort of way. This is at a moment in which Okonkwo, during the week of peace, starts beating one of his wives, and then he gets upset at the end of it and decides that he's going to go run off and go hunting, right? So the paragraph on the bottom of 38 begins, his anger thus satisfied. This is after he's just beaten one of his wives. His anger thus satisfied, Okonkwo decided to go out hunting. He had an old rusty gun made by a clever blacksmith who had come to live in Umuofia long ago. But although Okonkwo was a great man whose prowess was universally acknowledged, he was not a hunter. In fact, he had not killed a rat with his gun. And so when he called to Kimifuna to fetch his gun, the wife who had just been beaten murmured something about guns that never shot. Unfortunately for her, Okonkwo heard it and ran madly into his room for the loaded gun, ran out again and aimed at her as she clambered over the dwarf wall of the barn. He pressed the trigger and there was a loud rapport, accompanied by the wail of his wives and children. He threw down the gun and jumped into the barn, and there lay the woman, very much shaken and frightened, but quite unhurt. He heaved a heavy sigh and went away with the gun. Okay, now, in fact, Okonkwo is so poor at using his gun. He's so bad at finding his mark that it is obvious enough that his wife can joke about it as a way that she knows is really going to bother him in some sort of way. And she's able to kind of provoke him with this because it's that he's such a notoriously bad shot. So the one time that Okonkwo actually hits his target is when he wasn't aiming for that target at the funeral. So there's a certain amount of wry energy, right, surrounding this final scene, because of all reasons that Okonkwo could get exiled from his tribe. Who would have thought it would be on this grounds, right? The grounds that he shot somebody. And when he shot somebody, it wasn't in true Okonkwo fashion because he was angry and he felt wronged, but rather that he was trying to celebrate and did it by accident. Okay, so this goes deep to destabilizing our whole understanding of Okonkwo, and it is a little peculiar, I guess is the way to phrase it. Okay, on the other hand, we also have another tension that comes in this scene right at the end of part 1 that happens on page 125. Abiyarka, who is arguably Eshebe's voice in the novel. Abiyarka is reasonable in a way that sometimes Okonkwo just doesn't think things all the way through. He's not a deep thinker. Remember, he's a man of action, not words. And Abiyarka is a little more reflective. One of the things that happens after one clansman has shot another, which is what happened with Okonkwo, is that they have to go into exile. And not only that, but all the property left behind has to get burned to the ground, a la John Locke, I suppose. You know, all the property has to disappear. Okay, so Abiyarka, however, is really struggling with this, even as he's participating in the rituals that are going to help to clear and purify the location of someone who has inadvertently but still committed an unforgivable crime, right? An unforgivable, I mean, the word isn't used, but a sin against the gods in killing a clansman, right? So Abiyarka is kind of interrupting this text a little bit so Eshebe can provide something that's going to foreshadow later conversations. Abiyarka was a man who thought about things, is the last paragraph of part 1. When the will of the goddess had been done, he sat down in his obi and mourned his friend's calamity. Why should a man suffer so grievously for an offense he had committed inadvertently? But although he thought for a long time, he found no answer. He was merely led into greater complexities, and he remembered his wife's twin children who he had thrown away. What crime had they committed? The earth had decreed that they were an offense on the land and must be destroyed, and if the clan did not exact punishment for an offense against the great goddess, her wrath was loosed on all the land, and not just on the offender. As the elders said, if one finger brought oil, it soiled all the others. Okay, in other words, that the whole clan would be punished by the gods if it were not for their actions containing that wrongdoing in some kind of real substantial way. But Abiyarka's questions here are actually they're very much made out of sympathy for Okonkwo, should help us recall an earlier set of questions from page 61 by Nwoye. Okay, so on 61, about halfway through the paragraph after the break, right? Nwoye is being described in terms of his reflections as he's on a walk home. It was after such a day at the farm during the last harvest that Nwoye had felt for the first time a snapping inside him, like the one he now felt. They were returning home with baskets of yams from a distant farm across the stream when they suddenly heard the voice of an infant crying in the thick forest. A sudden hush had fallen on the women, who had been heard talking, and they quickened their steps. Nwoye had heard that twins were put in earthenware pots and thrown away in the forest, but he had never come across them. A vague chill had descended on him, and his head seemed to swell like a solitary walker at night who passes an evil spirit on the way, and then something had given away inside of him. It descended on him again, this feeling, when his father walked in that night after killing Ikemefuna. Okay, so part of it is recognizing in a fairly honest way in which these people are really struggling with the requirements of their religion and traditions, right? That this isn't simply an acceptance, that they don't feel this is a completed project, but there's actually room for new directions in it. It would be inaccurate to describe this as a static culture or a culture that had only one bounded set of rules. In fact, all of that is very vibrant in the first place. But the questions raised by Abiyarka and Nwoye are going to go a long ways towards helping us later understand why exactly Christianity is going to have an appeal here and how exactly it's going to make that appeal work. But although that's going to be a topic for the next conversation. Okay, so the real question that comes at this point in the text, when you should be pretty familiar, right, with both the cultures that's being described and understanding its limits and its growth and its pushing, what's static, what's dynamic, all of that kind of stuff, right? What are its rules, really? And that also you should be fond of many of the people in it, or at the very least see them as incredibly individuated, right? Look at through this whole text, all these like quick asides to small, tiny little stories that we never hear the rest of, right? That nonetheless convey to us that each person here has a whole book that could be written about them, right? And we, at the end of the first part, we recognize that Okonkwo's plans, right, because he's a planner, have basically been taken from him. his plans cannot be fulfilled. They're going to have to be changed because he will be exiled by this community that he's had a lot of success within. And this goes back to the title of the book, Things Fall Apart. What are the things? What is it? Is this just Okonkwo's world is in the process now of falling apart? Or is there something else that is a bigger sort of story within which that story is situated? No matter what, it has to start with going back to the Yeats poem, The Second Coming, from which the line of this novel is taken. Setting off, I should note, like a whole deluge of other people using parts of this poem for various artistic works. So if you go to the files section of our course webpage, you can download a copy of this poem called The Second Coming by William Butler Yeats. Okay, so I'm going to pause while you do that now. Okay, so this story of the Second Coming is a reference generally to the idea of the second coming of Jesus and the ensuing end of the world. Okay, so that's what the term second coming usually is used to explain or reference or create a historical name for something that hasn't happened yet. This poem was written right after World War I, published mostly in 1920 and published repeatedly because it was very popular. It captured a moment in the post-World War I era in which people were wondering whether it was possible to ever talk about stability again, given the ruptures that war had generated. It's also weird because the notion of the second coming, both biblically and in this poem, is not pleasant, right? It is hard. It is terrifying, right? It is slouching, right? Like a hunter enclosing on his prey. Okay, so if you read the poem really quickly to yourself, I'd encourage you to read it out loud, because if you read it out loud, the sound of the words, the poetry of how the words fit next to each other is arguably just as important as the content and definitions of those words. But if we look at just the last part, if we start with surely some revelation is at hand, the second stanza. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming, hardly are these words out when a vast image of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with a lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it real shadows of indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle, and what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born. Okay, so part of it is thinking about, in this particular poem, what is the Bethlehem and what is the creature? What is coming that is going to completely revise and start over everything else? So one of the questions you can pursue at this point is to ask yourself, what are the things that might unravel that have been important to this story and kind of held everything else together, right? What are the rituals, the traditions, the beliefs, the truths, right, that have held this community together that now is going to be slouched upon, right? And the slouching force, most people would say, is the idea of Western colonization entering into the African continent and entering into this community, that it is a rough beast, right, whose coming is treated as terrifying, whatever other consequences it might have. So I want you to read the poem to yourself a couple times and get a sense of its mood, its feeling, its tempo, and then return once again to that question of, if things are falling apart in this novel, has the falling apart started yet, or was this the first gesture, right? And that's really the question to look at. So please go ahead to the discussion board and answer that question. Are things falling apart? And if so, what was the first thing to fall apart? Okay, thanks. Have a good day.